Our experience has been that despite several attempts, the agenda does not sufficiently include the experiences of Dalits and similarly discriminated people. Of course, there is Goal 5 and Goal 10 looks at gender, and Goal 10 talks about the inequalities. But how do you make sure that these are informed to all other goals and bring clear targets and also indicators which pertain to measuring the progress that we have made in these targets and goals? I think that is critical. That element of looking at them critically, honestly, is missing in several of the engagements with the states. These global goals, such as SDGs, are very critical because they affect both the strengthening of the domestic localization as well as bringing out issues that the countries find it difficult as a challenge, so that you lift it off the country borders and keep it as a global issue or a regional issue. And while issues of caste-based discrimination that exist in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and India are very critical, and some countries like India and Nepal have very good laws, and Nepal is beginning to have good laws. The implementation is a very basic issue. And because of that, you have large gaps. And they say if India achieves the goals of poverty, of hunger, of unemployment and other things, if about 40% of the global goals are also achieved. So it's very important that we achieve these goals. The problem is implementation. So while localizing the SDG goals is taking place, there again we see Dalits are missing in the indicators, in the way the government is tracking finances. So there is traction, but there needs to be much more traction in order to affect poverty, hunger, intergenerational discrimination, the housing, health, and several of the goals that we're talking about, including Goal 16, which talks about justice and also ensuring that there is peace and security. Now, if those are not achieved for the Dalits and other excluded communities like scheduled tribes, the indigenous in India, then you are not going to be effective. So therefore, I think it's very important that these are figuring both, of course, at the localization level, but if that is a challenge, we need to lift it off and build sufficient encouragement at the regional and global level. I think one major gap that we have seen is in the localization and also in the voluntary national reviews that have come up. The disaggregated data is not sufficiently mentioned. They've also bundled the whole thing into just mentioning at socially excluded groups. While we do not have the problem of disaggregated data in the country, we are appealing to the government as to why not use the already disaggregated data in measuring poverty, in measuring hunger, in measuring all other goals. It's quite possible based on these scheduled caste and scheduled tribe factors, indicators, to build sufficient mechanisms to see how we can measure and take sufficient actions to fulfill. I think that needs to be worked on much more. The UNDP has facilitated in the past some of the more challenging, difficult issues to come on board and be discussed across the table. Our government is very, it's quite democratic, and it's the largest democratic country in the world. While we have that freedom to express at the duty bearer level and at the implementation level, there is a ceiling onto which some of these issues can be raised. It's a glass ceiling. And what UNDP has tried in the past is to see that how these aspects can be more creatively, more effectively be discussed so that possible solutions can be had. So, for example, we are looking at budgeting, and we are saying that public finance for the SDG goals is important. So, it's one is having policies, and then the other item is also to see that how public finance follows each of these goals, so that you have clear allocations that is necessary to make many of these targets achievable. And there UNDP has had some effect in gender budgeting. We would like to see more of work on Dalit and tribal budgeting, which is there, and we are trying to get more of traction on this area. I think one of the critical areas for UNDP is to map continuously to see who are the communities that are continuously missing around the table. Because if you're not on the table, your agenda is totally mixed. If your agenda is mixed, then there is no allocations, no policies, no mechanisms. So UNDP, being a little away from the direct implementation and the governance areas, it can raise some of the more difficult conversations to the respective governments. I think this is one major area that it can do. So while mapping it, the second is, I think, facilitating horizontal conversations from communities similarly discriminated across the region. Now I see that conversation missing in this regional knowledge exchange. We are looking at it. We're also facilitating the CSOs coming together, and I think I would like to acknowledge that the role that you have given to GCAP as well as AP regional CSO engagement coordination mechanism. But what is also missing is, in these, you need to have special focus on specifically excluded agendas in the SDGs, and play a proactive role in bringing them constructively, so that engagement with the localization, with the national governments is possible. I think that critical role UNDP has the ability, the capacity, and the location where it is very effectively can do. I think there are several takeaways. I was at the gender stream this morning, and I found Nepal's experience great. The way in their policies, what they have done, how they have clearly are beginning to emerge with policies specifically for the excluded groups. Of course, there is a lot of experiences of violence that will have to be there, but then there is a recognition, and that is seen in the way the dedicated SDG, the department is able to bring it in. I was also quite encouraged by the presentations of Malaysian government and the Philippine government, and of the other governments, one or two other governments, who felt that when we're talking about gender, we also don't need to look at only the survival aspects, bringing food and poverty and all that, but also look at levels of employment as various levels, including management. So how many percentage of the public sector companies have women's leadership at the top level? They're saying there are also attempts to see that this policy is also at the at the private sector level. It's a challenge that they're doing. Then the other item that I've seen is now currently going on in the session in the localization, especially at the local government levels, as long as the local governments don't receive sufficient finances for the implementation of different programs, the SDGs will not be realized, because it is at that level, it's the rubber meets the ground. So you will have more issues of many of the, at least I think around 6-7 goals are at the practical life of the people as they face with water, with health and sanitation and access to food, poverty, access to justice. It's very clearly there. So that's one area, and several governments, their experiences of how the Indian government also has made a very good presentation through the UNDP Assistant Director. And I found that the efforts to localize at the grassroots level is also very interesting. One aspect that I feel is not given sufficient focus is on Goal 16. The aspects of access to justice, aspects of looking at security and its both positive and negative implications on how it has on governance is something that we need to pay attention to, because that's one area each government says, you back off, no discussions on this. My issues with securities that's one issue. Then intergroup, the international migration, specifically of the excluded communities like Rohingyas, that's totally been missing in this thing. Rohingyas are also of the Dalits of Asia. They are the people who have been missed out. The boat people earlier, now Rohingyas and several. Well, the world is discussing on the Syrian refugees. I think the Asia Pacific has a different level of refugees. We have distress migration between India and Nepal, and there are no sufficient mechanisms to address it. I think SARC needs to be strengthened so that some of these issues, which are very critical for the region, I think that one area I feel we need to spend a little more energy on that.